Welcome everyone to our second presentation in Applied Anthroposophy on the theme of initiative. We are here tonight with Liz Beaven and John Bloom, and I'm really glad to be hearing from them. And we, as you enter, just get settled, and we will be lighting a candle together to open the space. So we will hear from each presenter and we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. So if something comes up throughout the presentation, just hold your question and we'll have a time after both Liz and John share. And then at the end, we'll be able to have a little bit of biography and social art together. So yeah, I will turn it over to Laura. Welcome everyone.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers tonight, both of whom I know very well from working relationships. I'm going to tell you a little bit about John Bloom right now before his presentation, and then before Liz speaks, we'll have a little pause after John, and then I'll introduce Liz. So John is the General Secretary of the Anthroposophical Society in America, and since 2016, and he's also a member of the Council of Anthroposophical Organizations, otherwise known as the CAO, which brings together leaders in the anthroposophical movement. He recently retired from RSF Social Finance in San Francisco, and he served as Vice President for Organizational Culture. Tell me that's not a cool title. And he there, and part of the reason we have John Bloom here with us tonight is he developed programs that address the intersection of money and spirit and personal and social transformation, which is pretty amazing kind of conversation. He's also developed a spiritually based leadership program and continues to do that work, and is forming a new organization called Spirit Matters, which serves anthroposophical initiatives. He founded Yggdrasil Land Foundation, and also he has written two books, one which I've got right here, which is called, hopefully you can see that, Inhabiting Interdependence and The Genius of Money. And one thing I want to say about John, if you listen to our podcast together, which we'll make sure you have a link for, you know he's very funny and very punny. So I don't know if we'll hear any of that tonight, but just know that a lot of humor goes into John's work. So happy you're here, John, and we're going to turn it over to you.
So thank you, and thank you all for taking time out of your very busy lives. And I'm actually honored to share the platform with Liz Beaven, and I think we'll find that there is a very profound connection between what I'm going to bring in the realm of threefold as a kind of framework, and then an introduction to economics as well. When Laura first asked me, well, could you do this? Could you introduce economics in threefold in 30 minutes or less? I kind of sat there and took that in and said, well, we'll do our best. So I'm not going to, just so you know, I'm not going to spend the evening defining a ton of terms. We don't have time for that, but I really would like to create, I would say, a mood of the essentials of what economic life is like and how we can think about it and be in the economy in a way that actually honors who we are as individuals and who we are as human beings. And for me, that is where, in many ways, the biggest shift has to happen. But before I do that, before I take that on, I wanted to read a poem, if I may. It's called Deciding, a poem by William Stafford. And it's one of those poems that I return to frequently because it both contains something of the reality of economic life, but also something of a recognition of spirit and aspects of social life that include the economics and the rights and spirit as well. And I'll read this at the beginning. I'll probably read it at the end, provided I leave myself enough time. And hopefully you'll hear the threefoldness in it. I will read it twice, by the way, just so you know. I'll read it once and then a little break, and then I will read it again deciding. One mine the Indians worked had gold so good they left it there for God to keep. At night, sometimes you think your way that far, that deep, or almost. You hold all things or not, depending not on greed, but whether they suit what life begins to mean. Like those workers, you study what moves, what stays. You bow, and then like them, you know what's God, what's world, what's gold. One mine the Indians worked had gold so good they left it there for God to keep. At night, sometimes you think your way that far, that deep, or almost. You hold all things or not, depending on not on greed, but whether they suit what life begins to mean. Like those workers, you study what moves, what stays. You bow, and then like them, you know what's God, what's world, what's gold. So I wish I had more time because I would love to know how many of you actually took up the exercise that we sent out in advance and how that was for you. And maybe some of you want to say something about that in the chat. We don't have time to really open up the space to hear about that, but maybe in the biography work it will show up, I hope. But it is a way of reflecting back what that aspect of you looks like, which we tend to move through very, very, very quickly. So the theme of this segment is actually around initiative. So I'm going to frame the whole notion of economics from the point of view of initiative. Really, how do we begin to imagine into the future of economic life? Most of us can talk about, to some degree, what economic life looks like right now. And we know that there's a huge struggle between what I would call self-interest, which is very much the story most of us, if you're at least as old as I am, most of us grew up with saying you need to work so you can meet your needs, or you make economic decisions to, take care of yourself. And the self-interest is the driving modality. And we have discovered, if you really study economic life, that self-interest hasn't really borne a lot of positive fruit from a social perspective. It has linked itself to sort of greed, overaccumulation, and I would say to some degree, the economic disparity, financial disparity that is current in our system is due to a kind of an overriding function of the me first self-interested value. So if we begin to imagine into the future of economic life, we also need to know how are we prepared to move from self-interest to community interest, and I would say, even if I can borrow a term from Peter Selg, into a selflessness into the economic priest. Not from a spiritual perspective, because our work is to know ourselves, right? And our work is to know not only ourselves, but everything that has conditioned who we are, how we got where we are. And we need to be able to do that in a culture, in a space of freedom, so that people aren't telling us who we are. But then we have to move out from that into social life and into working with others and seeing others. So the question that I hold is, what assumptions do we need to check, both for ourselves from an economic standpoint? So assumptions about money, assumptions we make about others and their relationship to money, judgments that we make, feelings that we have. If you think about, what's up for you every time you have to write a check to pay a bill, there's a story there that opens up a whole landscape of, well, where did that little, why do I have to pay my taxes energy come from as you're writing the check? And really stay with those feelings as they arise, because that's a part of your economic self which has been conditioned from stories passed on time and again. there's a wonderful little book written by Juliet Shore called Born to Buy. And in it, she has actually done a study of how conditioned we are throughout life, starting at birth, how conditioned we are to become consumers. And I think it's particularly true in US culture. But her study said that we actually see about 3,000 commercial messages a day, which is mind-boggling. If you think about all the branding and labeling and everything else that shows up, it's quite extraordinary. So if we want to take that on, the self-knowledge to kind of unpack that space so that we can step into economic life, one, out of freedom, which is freeing ourselves to be present for economic life, and then how we begin to recognize that every other human being is living with the same set of challenges. Not the same in the sense of it identical, but having to live through all the conditioning and circumstances that they're in so that we can actually meet them as another human being out of freedom and begin to recognize what can develop out of that. That is how we build culture. It is how imaginations change. It's how we learn. It's how we support each other in our practices and our rites and our rituals. And I think in many ways, biography work speaks very directly to that aspect of our life. By and large, my experience is that folks really get that, and our educational systems, as Liz will talk about later, are very geared toward how to learn and how to become yourself, and how to be effective in life, and how to have a career and make money and take care of yourself and all of the rest. And you can see in that little line of logic the kind of flow and narrative of self-interest that is sort of cleverly hidden in there. What we're not very good at is how we create our agreements around that. So we build up this quality of freedom, but then how do we step out of that and meet each other in this field of agreements, that space between us all, in which we can all feel present. And I think we know in the realm of agreements, we're in a state of high inequity, in terms of rights and freedoms from a political standpoint. And I read a survey of graduates of colleges who were then in the middle of their careers about what they felt prepared for in life. And this was maybe 5 years ago, so it's maybe old, but not that old. And the two things that showed up in this study, these are not just Waldorf students, these are just college graduates working in the world. And the two themes that emerged is people felt totally unprepared in the questions of how finances actually work, which is a subset of economics. And second, how do we actually make decisions? How does governance actually happen? How do I actually know how to participate and invite others to participate as equals in a participatory manner to make decisions that actually affect everybody? So that is a kind of governance framework. And we know that there are tremendous challenges around not just being equal in that, because we all may have equal rights, but the equity, the capacity to be able to exercise those rights. There are huge disparities in equity in that realm. So if we want to know what the work is from a threefold perspective, we have to work on the equity side so that we get to a point where we can exercise out of equality. And then in our current system, how do we participate in the economy and with what attitude? I've already mentioned this notion of self-interest, but if we want to move past self-interest, how do we awaken in ourselves not only an interest in others, but also the capacity to feel for others' needs and recognize other needs? Because the whole point of economic life is actually the meeting of material needs. You cannot work with economic life to meet spiritual needs. You can't work with economic life to meet emotional needs or feeling needs. And if you think through how compensation works or how we pay people, it's very much a kind of a boundary crossing in that, where we tend to think, I'm a better person if I get paid more. Well, what do you mean you're a better person if you get paid more? So we have a lot of work to do to decouple what I would say how we see and value ourselves in economic life such that we can be freed up to participate fully without thinking we're working for the money, and actually participate in an interdependent aspect where we know in a one world economy that whatever we do affects the rest of the world, and whatever anybody else is doing affects everybody else as well. So that's a very brief picture of economic life, but in the framework of never being separate from our spiritual and cultural lives and the rituals and rites that we do, and never being separate from the framework of agreements or governance that we've set up. And you have to know that as you're operating economically, every time you shift economic activity, you're shifting all the field of rights, and you're shifting, in a sense, how the spiritual world works and how we work with it. So what does it mean to think economically? I get asked that question all the time, because I often say, well, we need to change how we think economically. And people say, great, well, what exactly does that mean? And I like to start in a very simple way, which is to say, if we look at the world around us and think about economics, there are three basic elements in economic life. Almost everything happens as a result of that. There is under the natural resources that we're in. Remember, economics is around the material needs. So there's the natural resources that we're in. There is the capacity to work. So our ability to actually do things and make things and work together and collaborate. Collaborate meaning literally to work, really to work together. And then there's this whole question of capital. The first and foremost, it's really critical to know that those three basic elements, while they are the basic elements of economic life, are actually pre-economic. Capital in and of itself has no economic value. Natural resources in and of themselves actually have no economic value. And our labor in and of itself has no economic value. It's not until it begins to move and work on the land or organize labor that actually value emerges. And it's fascinating to me, because if you really sit with that concept, then we realize actually all economic life is grounded in gift. And that's not the way we tend to think of economic life. We tend to think of it as rights, but where did the natural resources come from? Where did our capacity to work come from? Where does capital come from? And I'll talk a little bit about capital in a minute, because that's by far the most complicated of them. But they actually arise as gift. You or I did not make, neither you nor I actually made forests or the lakes or the ponds. We didn't make the sky. We didn't make water. So they preceded us in a way. And we get to work with them and use them, but with what attitude are we transforming them? Does it change if it's, if I look at a forest and I look at that as a whole bunch of money that I just cut down those trees and I can produce and I can generate a whole bunch of profit from that? That for me is looking at the trees not as gift, but as commodities and as things, right? To be used and to be, yes, they are to be transformed. If I see them as gift, which is a circulation process, I not only look at the forest and see the value as timber, I also see, oh, well, this is a gift. And how does a gift continue to give? So I must give back if I'm going to receive things from it. A very different soul relationship to natural resources. And we know if from a simple economic analysis, we've tended to be much more on the extractive, we'll just take to produce profit and not think about regenerating much of our natural resources. And yet we are in a one world economy, meaning unless we fly or take a rocket ship to Mars and collect more natural resources there, we're going to have a limited supply and we need to begin to renew them. And that is, in a sense, connecting us with this notion of being stewards of the gifts. It's also true with labor, that we bring these gifts, but you cannot buy someone's labor because people are not commodities. And work itself, the capacity to work, is not a commodity. So if you look at compensation, for example, its sole purpose is actually to meet material needs. That's a theme that you should hear resonating through the economic, to meet material needs so that we are freed up to bring our capacities to work on behalf of others, right? As opposed to working for the money. No, we're actually working out of our gifts in recognizing others' needs. And for that, we are actually supported. So that's, to me, a really important concept. And then we come to the notion of capital. So for me, generally speaking, capital is often confused with money. And I listen to NPR, I listen to the radio, I listen to all sorts of, and capital and money get mixed together all the time. It makes me really sad because we tend to attach a lot to money as a thing. And money is really a storage, a value storage system and an accounting system. And it is a measure of economic practice and activity. But capital, and this is my definition, I don't know that you find it written anyplace else, capital is how spirit shows up in matter on the earth. So just hold that thought. So capital is how spirit shows up on matter on earth. Meaning we have an idea, and that idea comes down, we figure out what to do with that, figure out if it's of service, can we bring it into production, and then it moves into a very different space, it moves into the economic sphere. But intelligence, spirit, ideas, concepts, our reputation, these are all spiritual, in a sense, spiritual capital, right? That we want to bring down to the earth. If we think of capital as a thing, the logical result of that is basically to get a stock market in which we're going to use capital to make more capital. But that's not really on a moral, ethical, that's not what capital is. So education, right? Education, the purpose of that is actually to renew human capacities, to generate kind of the whole realm of ideas and innovation and seeing needs and bringing that new intelligence back down to earth to meet needs. So there's a beautiful cycle here between economic life, in which we work, right? And we kind of devote our lives to meeting needs through production, through the economic life, hopefully producing surplus capital, which in a true, I'm going to say in a true use of that capital, surfaces as gift also, because that's the notion of like, who produced that, right? That's a collective activity. It's not mine. I didn't make that. We collectively make that surplus, which then gets put back into culture, into education to renew human capacity. So in a beautiful fluid world, as we try to imagine the world into the future, think about all what capital could do if instead of being accumulated and collected by individuals, or actually, not that some accumulation isn't appropriate. This is not an anti-capitalist, pitch, but how much is enough? What creates sufficiency? And what could actually be put back into our culture, into the world, to renew human capacity, which is another word for education, right? And multiple other organizations like that as well. So that is a picture of the basics of so I'm going to say economic life. And hopefully that begins to change your relationship, because the whole notion of gift, and I would have to say this was one of the radical insights that Rudolf Steiner brought in his economics lectures, was to say that actually the gift is the most economically productive kind of capital, because it has all future bearing qualities in it. And that it's so important to remember that. And for me, the way I like to explain that is to say all of our lives begin in gift, right? As young babies, I don't believe that, we were charged for whatever nutrition we received. I don't believe that we were charged for the education that we received. That all came as gift, right? And of course, there's reciprocity in that. There's a lot of joy that's generated out of that. There is relationship that's generated out. There's feeling and care that's generated out of that, right? But it is a material need. To be able to eat, to our nutrients are hugely important. And out of that gift, new capacities get born, having ideas coming into the economy. This is a kind of a maturation process, right? Where we then find a vocation that is of service to the world. Our needs are met, surplus capital then goes back. So there's a beautiful fluid circulatory picture, which I like to land, and for me, I'm pretty close to, concluding time, is an imagination of the heart rather than the head. And by that, I mean, if we could imagine an economy into the future, that was my first question. What does it look like? How do we hold that into the future? That is heart-centered, that in fact is actually driven by the needs of the periphery, right? Because we know the heart is not a pump. It's not driving everything. It is a sense organ in a way, and a manager that is recognizing the needs of the whole system and adjusting itself to meet those needs. If there's a wound, it rushes blood there. If you're short of oxygen, it picks up the pace. So it is a much more of a manager and administrator as opposed to a leader. And I think that is really how we begin to change as a kind of core imagination of economic life, to say, are we participating in the circulation? Are we moving things along? Are we recognizing needs and moving the circulation to meet those needs? Or is it really just about me because, I'm the driver, I'm the pump, and I have all needs? So it's a different kind of picture. So I think I will stop there because I'm almost at my time. And I do want to close with one thought. So we have the human heart. And then there's this question of initiative. How does one take initiative? If you have an idea, you move in a kind of, I call that spiritual capital. An idea is not a thing, it has no weight. Spiritual capital, which then comes and has to have a social relationship, because if you just think it's all by yourself, you don't have a market, you don't have customers, you don't have people helping you do things. So actually, from an economic standpoint, to move out of the spiritual capital, it has to move into a quality of social capital, relationships, other needs, other partners, and thinking through that. And from the social capital, you will move into the physical capital, which might be surplus, it might be gains, it might be investments. There's lots of things that happen in the physical capital world, which often looks like is measured in money, right? So, and then that money gets expended to create new possibilities, one would hope. It gets gifted back, which then builds spiritual capital, and the cycle begins again. So if you think because you're a spiritual human being that physical capital will come your way without building a whole quality and platform of social capital, it's a setup for failure. So if you're taking initiative, not only is the idea, but is there a social basis for it? And is that social basis actually interdependent, right? Is it a recognition that everybody has a piece in the puzzle, and it's about circulation? So I think I'll stop there. And I did want to close with reading the poem. And I do hope that you hear something of the spiritual and the rights and the economy in this poem. One mine the Indians worked had gold so good, they left it there for God to keep. At night, sometimes you think your way that far, that deep, or almost. You hold all things or not, depending not on greed, but whether they suit what life begins to mean. Like those workers, you study what moves, what stays. You bow, and then like them, you know what's God, what's world, what's gold. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. We're just going to have a quiet moment before we introduce Liz. I want to thank you for bringing us an imagination of the heart and circulation and supporting the system. And, you know, we are in this theme of initiative. And I think that these good thoughts and these new imaginations are in fact initiative, and especially when we have them together. And so I think that that changes things. So thank you for bringing us that new picture. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Liz Beaven, who is the provost for the California Institute of Integral Studies, also in San Francisco, a very interesting university. And she's also the president of the Alliance for Public Waldorf Education and has over 35 years of experience in Waldorf education, teaching, being an administrator, doing adult education. You'll soon hear that Liz was born and raised in New Zealand and is a grandparent of 5 grandchildren. And she's very passionate about the questions of inclusion and social justice, and believes that Waldorf education just has so much to offer in general, offer education in general. I met her when she was the president of Rudolf Steiner College, and she was also the administrator at the Sacramento Waldorf School. And I think her favorite coffee drink is a chai latte, something like that, right? Yes, okay. Well, thank you, Liz, so much for being here, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Laura. And hello, everyone, wherever you are. It's so nice to be with you. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to think again about Waldorf education, because my relationship with it is not an uncomplicated one of, it is this best thing ever. I believe that, along with a lot of other things and questions. And John and I prepared independently, but it's always fascinating when you have 2 people working on something, how many parallels and echoes there are. So I'll do my best to pick a few of those up, because of course, as John said, economics and education are very deeply tied. And what I would say is, in its ideal, education is not a commodity, but in reality, it and children are often treated as a commodity. And yet in education at its best, and most teachers are striving for the best, is this idea of the renewal and development of human capacity. And that is at the heart of Waldorf education. And referring to John's poem, of course, the gold that we are admiring and in some ways mining or bringing to the surface is the uniqueness of each of the children who are before us and their futures. So that's a little preface, and Laura has given you an introduction, but whenever I approach something like this, I come across, who am I? And that is the introductory picture that Laura has given you, that I have visited and revisited Waldorf education from many different perspectives now over a long time. But the other part of that is, who am I to speak on this large topic, despite that experience? Because my experience with Waldorf education has always been one of a practitioner. I entered as a parent and then quickly as feet on the ground training at the first Waldorf school, not in 1928, but in the first Waldorf school established in this country, which is the Rudolf Steiner School in New York, a little later than that. Some days right now in COVID time, it feels about that long, but and in these various roles, I've continued to come back to these questions of what is the purpose of education? And I asked you all to reflect on your own experience. Why do we educate? Why do we have schools? And this one gets complicated because we all have firsthand experience and opinions coming out of our firsthand experience, which is a little different from some other fields. But my questions have continued to be, what are we doing and how are we doing? And who are we doing it with? And what's our purpose? And that led me to the emerging public school work, because in this country, Waldorf education has a complex history as a largely independent school movement for a very long time, which brought some real gifts, but some economic questions about how do we have more access, how do we have more inclusion, how do we pay for this thing, because there is that piece of the economic system, unfortunately, because we treat education as a commodity. So who am I to address this? I think this is also related to the question of initiative. I was the person at the time with an intersection of experience here who was tapped on the shoulder and invited gratefully and with trepidation to address this. And last summer, I came up with a title about scaffold or ladder that I think was still put out. My thinking has moved quite far from there. Last summer was a long time ago, but within that is this question of access, breadth, horizontality. Who are we educating and how? So I will try to come back to that a little bit. But I'd like to speak briefly a little bit about Waldorf education or education in general as initiative, because economics and education clearly are linked. From my perspective, we could have also put Waldorf education as an act of freedom or towards freedom. It's often spoken of as education toward freedom. It's a deed of love in many ways to work reciprocally with children and families. And it is ideally a service. And yet here we are as an initiative, which fits to me very well with its source and its purpose, because as we know, Steiner was not just an initiate, he was a man of initiative. And he acted, and he called on us to act. And so this weaving of the spiritual and the practical, which we see throughout his work, shows very, very clearly in the field of education. He actually was interested in questions of education throughout his life, early experiences working in education in different ways. And it was as early as 1906, 1907, when he began really writing and lecturing on education, and most of his ideas are right there then. But he didn't have a vessel for it yet to land it. But in these early lectures, he emphasized the spiritual nature of education and described it as a moral and spiritual necessity. He was concerned about education. And then, of course, in his typical style, he took action in response to a question, an invitation, or a need. So in 1919, with the collapse of Germany, with the disaster that had been World War I, with incredible political, economic, social, and cultural chaos, he was approached and asked to land now this question of education in a real school with real children and real teachers. And we know that when we make the spiritual physical, we learn a lot, we see a lot. So it's also interesting that at that time there was a global pandemic. It's not often mentioned in the context of Waldorf education, but in this time, 100 years later, a little over 100 years later, we see some echoes that I think are really worth thinking about. So we now have the initiative of the initiator, Rudolf Steiner, at the beginning of a school. We have the initiative of the teacher, the student, and the parent in particular within schools. And we have the initiative of Waldorf education itself within the field of education. So this is why I asked you to do a little reflecting on what are we doing with this question of education in schools with children? Why do we educate? Because Waldorf education is not yet a fully realized ideal. That's going to take a long time. And we are in the field of education in general, and we are governed and swayed by some of the same forces that shape education in general. Remember at the beginning, I said, one of the challenges is we have a materialistic picture appropriate to our time, and we tend to treat children, teachers, and education as commodities. So what is the impact of education? Why do we educate? Well, There are some very practical, explicit reasons. If you look at statements by the US government, we educate for career preparedness, college readiness, and in order to be able to compete in a global economy. It's all spelled out for us. We also, as we've discovered to our pain since March, we need to take care of children so that the rest of economic and social life can proceed. Anyone who's been homeschooling willingly or unwillingly since March, or assisting schooling, will know exactly what we're talking about. So there is this need for the care of children. There are a lot of other explicit goals as well, common pool of knowledge, information, etc. Yes, education is part of the industrial complex, John, for sure. But we also have implicit goals. And in this country, they're not all very attractive. Some of them are, but one of them throughout history has been to keep people in their place. There is a sorting aspect to education. So when we ask who is in our schools as Waldorf education, we have to really look and see what we're doing there. And there are aesthetic and cultural needs that are often implicit and in some theories easily dismissed. Then we come to Waldorf education as part of the educational industry or system, however we want to describe it. And we quickly go big because Steiner insisted that this is a moral, spiritual task, the education of children, the work of the teacher, the education of the teacher, I would say, having been a teacher for a long time, with the objective of nothing less than social and individual transformation through the development of capacities, through the link with the spiritual, and remembering when he started this first school with a goal of building a better future. Now, economically, we've for a long time, I know I was brought up with this, our children are going to have it better than we have it. So there's been this sort of idea of unlimited growth and reproduction. This is a different picture. It is saying in order to have this better future, we need a new art of education that really frees the gold in every incarnating individual and allows them to do their work in this lifetime on Earth to build a better future. So we are looking at supporting the evolution of humanity, growth in a very particular way. One of the challenges in this is what I've increasingly been thinking about as a tension between education as a cause and education as a cure. And I think with the reckoning in various ways that we've all been engaged in particularly within this last year, but building certainly this century, still seems so odd to say that, but here we are, that we see education economically and other ways, that we have a huge responsibility. Education has had a large role in getting us to where we are right now around social justice issues, including racism, classism, discrimination, economic disparities, gaps in needs and achievement. So that is one. Waldorf education is not exempt from that. So I'm trying to give a fairly clear-eyed contextualizing for this thing that I do think is a jewel called Waldorf education. We're not exempt. And we must be aware of context. We must, as educators, in my opinion, understand things like the impact on education of where our children are able to live, the history of redlining, the impact of Brown versus the Board of Education in terms of Black education, the gaps in resources, intergenerational. We need to be of our time, and I'll get to Steiner's words about that in a few minutes. But holding the other side of these scales, we have education as the part that, from my point of view, the greatest potential for cure. the greatest possibility of addressing what ails us, the Parsifal question, what ails thee? Because through the type of education that Steiner spoke of, and that we have been attempting to realize for over 100 years, we have the greatest hope of creating lasting change, building towards a different future for our children. But I think we are required to be mindful of the fact that it's not one, it's not the other. There is dynamic, creative tension there between cause and cure. So why? We have a bit of a picture, and this is all very brief. Why we educate within Waldorf education is certainly this striving towards righting some of that historical injustice, working towards a new art of education that works from a true picture of the nature of who we are as human beings, that sees the link between spiritual impulses and the practical, and that works with the reckoning that we're all engaged in. I know we were asked with these to be in contemporary terms, and these are obviously the major issues that we're looking at right now. So we are working with profound ideas around children, education, purpose of life, etc. We are working with some disconcerting elements of that are increasingly being discussed and worked with. We are working in a movement that is global but not universal. So we're needing to change some of our thinking around universal. And we are asking how we are doing at 100+ years with some of those original goals. The goals have not changed. The need for the goals have not changed. But we are looking at how we enact those goals, given where we are in the history of this country and in the history of humanity. So I'd like to spend the last little bit with one of the groups of initiators that I mentioned very briefly at the beginning. We have the children who are before us, and we hope that as educators, they are at the center of our work and our striving. I was a school administrator for a long time, and I will tell you it's quite easy to forget that that's the purpose of a school. So we need to keep coming back to these amazing, extraordinary beings to whom we are entrusted, with whom we are entrusted. We have Steiner and his role and his dictates and advice to us. And again, not easy, because all the way through, he says in all of the education work, test it, take a look at it, reinvent it every day. Think about what you're doing and why. And who is doing that testing, reinventing, thinking? It is the teacher. And more than any other system of education that I have studied or been involved in, Waldorf education situates the teacher as a very important person in the middle of the picture. So in Waldorf education, teachers really matter. This is serious work, not to be undertaken lightly. Maybe, Tess, we could just pop that slide up for a moment. The teacher is really the builder of this new vision of education, not on their own, but actually in response to the children, in response to the parents as well as the guardians of those children, in response to the spiritual world and its requirements, in response to this fundamental picture of the human being and building this art of education. But here we have the teacher, and as Steiner said in 1919, to the very first group of Waldorf teachers whom he had just intensively worked with for 2 weeks in order to be ready to start this whole new pedagogical approach, mind-boggling. But that there are certain requirements for us as teachers. And the one that he mentions over and over again is a categorical imperative for the teacher, which is to keep your imagination alive. This ability to meet the children out of pictures, to observe the children, to understand what they need from us, to adapt and adjust, knowing where they are coming from, big picture, local picture. And so he also emphasizes, which is an interesting thing when we look at contemporary educators like Parker Palmer, what is most important, what really matters. He says as early as 1907, what really matters is who the teacher is, what the self-development is, what the work on oneself is, what the inner terrain is. And he states, the day will come when teachers will not be tested for knowledge, but for who they are. And that is the awesome responsibility of working with the next generation, that who we are is going to leave its imprint on the children. And some of his lectures are quite daunting as to what our impact is. So as teachers, we take on this task. Luckily, he also reassures us that the children receive our striving and effort. So we can keep going in every day and trying again. We can keep asking for help. But Steiner did not often give clear, firm directions. Most of us like to play games of Steiner says. Steiner said it should be this. Steiner said it should be that. If you are in a Waldorf school, you often hear that things are categorized by the community as this is Waldorf, this is not. And when we strip that all down, what we discover is that a lot of it is not what was given. What was given was indications, but at the end of these 2 weeks, he did give directions to these groups of new Waldorf teachers. First time they could use that term at the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory, Waldorf teachers. The first one at the end of Study of Man, and we tried a new title of that book and it didn't stick, but it needs to change. 1919, The Need for Imagination, a Sense of Truth, a Feeling for Responsibility of Soul. These three are the very nerves of pedagogy. And whoever would become a teacher needs to take this up as a motto. And the way it is usually said is imbue yourself with the power of imagination. Have courage for the truth. Sharpen your feeling for responsibility of soul. As I was digging around, I found the words on the left here are written by Henry Barnes, a different translation way back in the introduction to, I think, The Essentials of Education. And I like this because it's so clear, and sometimes to come at an idea with different words is really helpful. Enliven the imagination, stand for the truth, feel responsibility. So this is well known, recited by many faculties, many teachers, used as a model. We can unpack it in all sorts of different ways. But he had a second lecture series going on at the same time, aptly called Practical Advice to Teachers, and it's very practical. And at the end of that, Tess, if we can have the next slide, he gives 4 principles for teachers. And now we begin to see the initiative needed in this building this new art of education, because not one of these is small. The teacher must be a person of initiative. See, it ties right to our topic. The teacher must be a person of initiative in everything done, great and small. If that's not enough, the teacher should be one who is interested in the being of the whole world and of humanity. So we do need to wrestle with our context constantly and be aware of it. And then third, particularly important with children who read us, We are transparent often to children, even if we think we are not. The teacher must be one who never compromises in the heart and mind with what is untrue. And then, because the children, the young people, are going to react and respond and grow with the enthusiasm that we are able to bring to the marvel of what we are bringing them, which is the human story. The teacher must never get stale or grow sour. And he also talks about interesting things like humor. And those of us who've had any relationship with children, Tess, we can go off for a moment, know that if we turn up without a sense of humor, we may as well really give it up for the day and go home. So this presence, this connection to our time, to this world, interest in the world, understanding of the world, staying fresh. He actually says you need to recreate every day, and being truthful. But in all of that, this idea of initiative. So I, like John, am almost out of time. And the only thing I would say in wrapping this up, which hopefully is of some help, or provocative, I hope, is we mustn't forget the gold. As we at 100+ years ask who we're teaching, how we are teaching, what about questions of Eurocentricity, what has changed, what is stuck, we mustn't forget, in my opinion, the breadth and depth and inspiration of this approach to educating children. Those goals that are still as true about transformation for the good, for the future. The making physical the spiritual, helping each child as this remarkable gift onto their way. And so we come back to what we are doing. What is the purpose of education? And to my mind, it's beautifully summed up. I'll have my own. John had a poem. I'm calling this one a verse. And I can never say these words without a procession of young people in front of me. First graders on the opening day of school, kindergarteners, 12th graders preparing to graduate and step out into the world. Children at every stage of the journey of childhood, encountering themselves and encountering humanity and encountering one another again and again as they walk through this thing called Waldorf education. And so, Tess, maybe we could put the last slide up. The ringing of the bells, written by Steiner for a young child. And to me, the image of the human being, the purpose of education, and in many ways, the curriculum is right here. To wonder at beauty, stand guard over truth, look up to the noble, resolve on the good. This leads us truly to purpose in living, to right in our doing, to peace in our feeling, to light in our thinking, and teaches us trust in the workings of God, or all, in all that there is, in the widths of the world, in the depths of the soul.
Thank you so much, Liz. And we'll just have a moment of quiet again, and as everyone can think of any questions they have. I just want to draw again on this the power of thinking and freedom in our thinking, and these imaginations that you've brought as well here, Liz, as John did, of these children. You said you can imagine them walking by with this freedom and love and initiative within themselves with that last verse. So I can imagine what it would be like for all of us. We were all imagining that for our educational systems in this country and in other countries, that beautiful picture that you just gave us. Thank you. So now we have some time for question and answers. And people can, if you could, in the participant section, please raise your hand. There's a little hand, and then we'll unmute you to ask your question. So take a second. If you're shy to do that, you can, of course, send your question to me or to Tess. I saw Donnie put a great comment in the chat about education and BIPOC communities and how that is perceived. So thank you, Donnie, for that contribution, and lots of other contributions in the chat as well. But anybody that wants to speak, now's a great time before we move into our biography work with Chris.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Mine is a little, not really a question, but I just wanted to bring something that I don't see, unfortunately, in the United States. I grew up in Turkey, and there's healthcare there, and education is free. Okay. The whole idea is that there's a social contract between the citizens and the government. We pay taxes and we get services. It's not a rich country by all means. And right now we have a dictator, so that's a whole different thing. But the system, the idea is that the government is going to take care of us. Mm-hmm. So my parents sent me a private school. That's why they had to pay money. But I went to college there, undergrad. I didn't pay any money. And then I came here, United States, to do my PhD, which I got some stipends and things like that. And I didn't pay anything. Okay. So I got my education totally free. And now my daughter has $100,000 student debt. Okay. And when I say this to my brother, he can't fathom it. He's like, why can't they take care of their citizens? Why are they not investing in their citizens? So we talked about capital, of course, the capital system here. You know, people don't understand what social democracy is because, you know, we have a social democrat government there, or the system that was set up that way. And so, you know, the history of the country, and I stayed here, you know, my daughter was born here, and we're in the, you know, system. I'm a teacher in a college, but I don't understand why people cannot imagine in the United States a system that works for them. Okay, that we're not treated as commodities. We're like a cog in the whole system, and our resources, our labor is being sucked basically, and we're left with nothing. Because if you trip a couple of times in this country, it's like you're 3 paychecks away from being homeless almost. And that just breaks my heart, basically. So that's, I mean, a question maybe, why can't we have that imagination here in this country?
Thank you, Meryl. That's great. And it goes to both of you, I think, to address that. Thank you for that story. Mm-hmm.
So my immediate response is, and thank you, Meryl. I think those of us who grew up in a different system have some questions. And yet here we are with this task of the task of this country.
Yep.
The ideal of public education in this country, as with many of the sort of early ideals, is very high. It's a very high ideal, and the reality is very far from that ideal. And in some ways, we've built an educational system that reinforces status. You know, I look at the city in which I currently live, San Francisco. Children who are in private schools have been in school to some degree since the end of August. Children who are in public school have not been in a classroom for almost a year. I will let John comment maybe further on that, but I think it's, you know, there's a laying bare right now. The question is, what will we do? I mean, that this wonderful picture of Waldorf education and all of the children I can see walking through it, that is not many children.
Great. I mean, I can jump in here. Can I? Yeah, great. How much time do we have? Because I want to make sure, well, because it's a really huge question. I mean, you're talking about a systemic issue, and to unpack it would require understanding both, I would say to some degree, something of the mission of the United States as a country and in the economy, and the consequences of that, and the thinking that needs to be worked through now that is not about self-interest, because actually self-interest is an extractive system. So I collect capital for me, and I actually spoke to some degree about a very different imagination about the flow of capital back into culture. But we have starved our culture, right? And you know, those folks who complain about paying taxes, well, actually taxes are a kind of mandatory gift, right, to the common good. So how do we feel about taxes? So it's such a laden question with so many, you know, aspects to it, that I think actually would come, the end of it would be seen if we actually begin to change our own relationship to the economy. The change would come, because we're then start to bring the human being at the center of what it's about. The whole point of economic activity, if we really imagine a future, is to free up human capacity. But that's not how we're structured right now. So there's a lot more I could say, and you can tell, but I'm not going to.
That was an amazing, heartfelt question, Meryl. Thank you for bringing that into this.
Absolutely.
Really beautiful. Tess was just commenting on how real that question was. Thank you. We do have another question, and this is a little more off topic than what we just talked about. But Liz, the question is coming about the appropriate role of electronics in education. And so this is certainly a hot topic right now, and I wonder how that relates to the economic picture too, and how that relates to the development of the human being. So if you could answer that in 2 minutes, that'd be great. All these huge questions in short time, but we get to live with these questions. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try 1 minute, speaking quickly. This is a conundrum. We have, as a movement, have been at the forefront of understanding the problems, the issues of screens and virtual reality with young children in a time when screens and virtual reality are part of our lives. The old idea that you could keep children away from screens is naive, because you can't walk through life without them. And then we were thrown into the pandemic with all of the questions about virtual education. So technology is a tool, and we have to keep remembering that, because it tends to become our master. It has been a means of doing some extraordinarily creative relationship-based things with children over this last year, and that's not going to go away. But we have also seen remarkable initiative from teachers, parents, and students to work within this and to balance it, and to keep, I think the trick here is to keep coming back to what is core to any educational system, not just Waldorf. What are the core principles that stand at the heart of it? And how then can we work with those in whatever circumstances are given to us? You know, if we're going to go into an area with no resources, we're not going to have a whole bunch of the beautiful stuff we usually associate with Waldorf schools. We can still do amazing things with children. I think it has asked us to challenge a whole bunch of assumptions, but also to validate a whole bunch of beliefs. And the children still needed their teacher. So it's complicated. We don't understand it yet because we were all thrown into action research. And unfortunately, what we're experimenting on is children out of necessity. We're all in a giant human experiment right now.
Yes, indeed we are. Thank you so much, Liz, for that answer. And we have one more question before we move into biography. Here you go, Thomas.
Hi, thank you. While we have our wonderful guests, I really appreciate what you had to say, and I agree with pretty much everything. And I'm wondering if I can press you to say just a little bit more about whether you have any particular insight into how we spark that change of heart that's required, in particular with people outside of anthroposophy, that's needed to essentially change that feeling towards our economic system and our educational system. I mean, that's to me what is really required, and while we're on the topic of initiative, if you have maybe some insight that we might take with us. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I love the idea of.
Sorry, John, you just got muted somehow. Can you try again?
That's
there
okay.
you go.
Yeah,
There you go.
I love the idea of taking insight away with you, because at least it won't burden you with much more weight. It's a spiritual element. So, yeah, I mean, my experience has been that 100 years after associative economics was, spoken, there are movements around regenerative economics, restorative economics. God, there's one more that, ecological economics. There's a whole group of individuals who are shifting, and they all have different kind of takes about it. But if you begin to ask the question of saying, who wants that old system? What does the new system look like? And be willing to be in conversation, you will find colleagueship, right? If you feel like you have to sort of speak for, I only do associative economics, that's not a good way to get started. But if you look at some of those core principles that actually lifts up the human being in the economic world and find others who do that, you will find partnerships. The growth of the cooperative movement in the United States is just one example of a radical shift in how people are wanting to form associations, right? That's a corporate form, but there are new cooperative forms that include producers, consumers, and distributors, which is basically an association. That's a whole. So medical practices that are operating as community-supported medical practices, you just have to start with community and build from there.
And I would add just very quickly, Thomas, is that Canada I hear in your voice? There's a question for me as to what is the role of something like Waldorf education in this next century? Is it to remain as this movement that has an impact and an importance, or is it also to act as a leavening going out into education more generally? To help with transformation of education. At one point late in his life, I think it was in The Roots of Education, Steiner made this interesting comment that the purpose is not to establish a system of anthroposophic schools, but to work in the heart and being of any teacher. So I ponder that a lot. And the other thing, the big question, I think, with where we're sitting right now is, the magic 8 ball is telling us to ask again later, answer not clear. And I'm reminded over and over again right now, we've had a huge amount of experience as human beings in this last year. Will we all go back to sleep and pretend it didn't happen? Or will we make some fundamental values shifts? And for me, with particular passion, that is around childhood, children, and education and families. And so I am reminded, of Christopher Fry's question, will we wake for pity's sake? I wish I could tell you we will, but I think we each have our bit as people of initiative to do there.
Thank
I
you
think,
both.
can I just add a quick, sorry.
Yeah, we just have to go to our breakout rooms next. So that's
I know.
excellent. Yeah, go for it.
I think it's also important to know that you have ideals and to live into those ideals. And behind every idea is an ideal. Make the ideals transparent, because then you'll find colleagueship. But also know when you make your ideals visible, that also draws the adversary forces, right? That will try to keep us separated, will get us confused, to not talk to each other. So just be mindful that as you hold your ideals, you're going to have to overcome that which is what you call going to sleep, Liz, in a way. But you know, who benefits by keeping us from these conversations? It's certainly not the children, right? And it's not each other.
But we are not alone.
Right.
And I
right.
think for a long time we thought we were. We are not alone. We have allies and traveling companions.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is amazing. Thank you. And thanks for that, all these beautiful questions. We're going to turn it over to Chris Burke now to have you all talk to each other and maybe find some of these allies in this room for sure. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you and then we'll go into the breakout rooms. Thank you so much. Thank you both. Super powerful.
Yeah, thank you both. Those were such wonderful lectures and such great discussion questions there. And you know, full disclosure, you know, as anthroposophists, we have to remain flexible. I had planned a certain exercise that I wanted to do, and I just totally decided to change it in while I was listening to you both. So we'll see how this goes. But before we dive into the question, I just want to briefly remind you of the agreements that we work with when we share in these groups. The first important agreement is to share only what you wish to share in these spaces. So you're in control of how much you share. You know where your own limits are and you can respect those limits. Second, you're going to practice open-hearted listening when others are speaking. Really just try to set your own self aside and give the gift of listening, open yourself in service to listening to the story of the others. And then third, respect the confidentiality of those stories that are shared in that space. That if you accept them as something that's given in service to the one who's sharing the story, then that story really just belongs in that space and nowhere else. Okay, so what I thought we could do is to look back in our experience and find a teacher who was especially meaningful to you. And as you find that especially meaningful teacher for you, try to find the most valuable gift that you received from them. And then think about, fast forward through your life, in what ways have you given that gift back to the world? So we'll give you a minute or two to reflect. Then you're going to go into breakout rooms. Breakout rooms, you're going to go into groups of 3 and you'll share for 3 minutes each. And we will send reminders into the rooms when it is time to switch.
Okay, so I'm just working on these rooms. Some of them have 2 and some have 3. And again, just that reminder, please make sure there's equal sharing time for everybody. That's a justice thing. So let's go for that. Okay, you're automatically going to be sent to your room. So here we go. Go ahead, Chris.
All back? Okay,
I think
great.
we're all back. Yep.
Great. Well, hope you had a nice time sharing in your small groups with your partners. I know in the main room, Liz and Laura and I were reminiscing about all of our favorite teachers and fun memories from school. So we don't have time to do any sharing in this larger group. So if you just want to take those memories and those conversations with you into your sleep, you can see what fruits they bring for you in the coming days. And I'll hand it back over to Laura.
Thank you. And actually, we're just going to say goodbye and thank you. So you should all be able to unmute yourself in just a minute. And maybe we could just be able to see everybody here and put your view on gallery, and then you can say goodbye. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you so
Bye.
much, Liz.
Bye.
Thank you, John. Bye.